I'd like to invite your attention this morning to our scripture reading. Today's scripture reading comes to us from an unusual book, the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, which is the third book in the Old Testament between the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers. You will find today's reading on page 95 in our Pew Bible. And you can also access the reading on your tablet or smartphone via our guest internet access. From the book of Leviticus, chapter 9, verse 22 through chapter 10, verse 3. Aaron lifted his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he came down after sacrificing the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the offering of well-being. Moses and Aaron entered the tent of meeting and then came out and blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Now Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his censer, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered unholy fire before the Lord, such as he had not commanded them. And fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord meant when he said, 'Through those who are near me I will show myself holy, and before all the people I will be glorified.'" And Aaron was silent. Blessings on this unusual and disturbing passage of Scripture this morning. The minister could see her face of rage. Mrs. Thompson has been a faithful member of Pilgrim Lutheran Christian Church for 45 years. But her face was full of rage. And the minister had only been there about 3 years. But he knew what was coming. He first saw it as soon as the youth group got together and started playing guitars and the keyboard that was set up on the stage. And while most smiled in the congregation, Mrs. Thompson did not. As the pastor was greeting everyone, Mrs. Thompson was slowly approaching. And one after the other, the minister waited for what he knew was coming. "I didn't like the youth song," Mrs. Thompson bellowed. "That's not worship, that's entertainment." Now the minister didn't know what to do exactly. He was already thinking of his response because he knew it was coming. He knew that this would be it. "It wasn't a song I know," Mrs. Thompson replied. "I'm so sorry to hear this, Mrs. Thompson," Pastor replied. But I didn't think the worship service was about worshiping you, Mrs. Thompson. Worship for a minister is oftentimes life-threatening. Because worship is more than picking out Mrs. Thompson's favorite hymns. Worship is more than about making sure the paraments are correct. Worship is more than this. Worship, as our passage this morning will tell us, is life-threatening. And it can, in the poor situation with Nadab and Abihu, kill you if not done properly. Because it's too bad that Nadab and Abihu thought that they could break a little bit with the tradition they had just seen and get an extra helping, so to speak, of God's presence themselves. Now, today I imagine that I am the first pastor in Prairie Avenue history to even preach from this book of Leviticus. Now, the name seems to imply that it's instructions for Levites, but here's the interesting thing about Leviticus. Levites are only mentioned once in the entire book. And our English name came from the Latin translation of the Bible, which was drawn from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So it might be better to call Leviticus by its early rabbinical name. It's Torah Konanam. And since I'm pretty sure most of you don't know Hebrew, it means simply the priest's manual. And if you begin to read the Bible from cover to cover, like we all attempt to do, it's probably around this book of Leviticus that you start to drift. First of all, at least 8 sacrificial offerings are described in livid and vivid detail. And then following that, you have another 8 chapters of prohibitions against eating shellfish, against eating pork, and wearing polyester cotton in the presence of the Lord. And our scripture reading this morning comes to us from a longer description of the story involving Aaron, his 2 eldest sons, and Moses that are preparing the necessary offerings. Each one of those Levitical offerings that are described, and they have been anointed by Moses, but they must stay in the tabernacle for 7 days prior to offering their first sacrifice. It's this first sacrifice that Aaron and his sons are going to offer. Now, the tabernacle was a movable worship tent that the Israelites used while going on the Exodus between Egypt and the Promised Land. And they were the days when a pillar of fire would appear and they would follow the presence of the Lord until that pillar of fire stopped. And then they would camp, set up the tabernacle, and wait until the pillar of fire moved them again. Because you see, Aaron and his sons have now offered. That's where our story begins. They've just offered the sacrifices outside the tabernacle, and they bless the people, and then Aaron and Moses go back into the tabernacle, and the people have to wait. Their anxiety probably rises. What's going on in the tabernacle? Is God really in that presence? And speculation grows among the crowds until once again Aaron and Moses reappear and bless the crowd again. And then suddenly all offerings on the altar outside the tabernacle are set ablaze, and the glory of the Lord, as is described, appears among the people, and flames shoot out of the tabernacle and devour all of the sacrifices just laid by Aaron and his sons. So the priests have done their duty, and now God's presence has been among the people. This ritual, this tradition of mediation between priests and God and the people is celebrated, perhaps a little too much, because this successful demonstration of God's power and presence seems to have fostered some irresponsible thoughts with Nadab and Abihu. The smoke is clearing away from the altar, and you can perhaps see it in your mind's eye that Nadab and Abihu are going, well, now what? Where is this God? We saw the fire go out, and the fire is now becoming embers. Is God left the building with the smoke? So, I don't know. Abihu, what do you think? Do you think maybe what we should do is grab some of the remaining coals of the altar, put a little incense in it, and fill our censers and offer the same thing to get God to come back? Well, Abihu and Nadab did, at their own peril, because we're told in a rather odd, cryptic thing that they offered a strange fire, Nadab and Abihu, to the Lord. One that wasn't commanded, one that wasn't authorized. It was strange, foreign even. And Nadab and Abihu broke that boundary between tabernacle and the people. Because it wasn't the ritual that brought God into the room. God was already there. What the ritual did was make the people be arrived in God's presence. And this was just the method to have the people be in God's presence. Because sometimes calling on God inappropriately may unleash unanticipated consequences, because God doesn't really need rituals. We will read in the prophets later that He hates their festival. He hates their mournful things. He hates their rituals because they've abandoned Him. They're just going through the motions. God doesn't need the rituals. It's us who need them. Because when one is near to the presence of God, one needs to be cautious. And our worship rituals allow us to seek God's presence within protective structures safely. This building is an accumulation of worship in many ways. This building was completed in 1952, and many of you recall a sanctuary without the stained glass windows that were open to the outside, and you fanned yourselves with funeral home fans without air conditioning. God help us all. Many of you remember this campaign and the striving for the pipe organ to be installed in here in 1980. It was a full accomplishment, a 13-rank Wicks organ to replace the at times troubled electric organ that was often used. Now, what is frightening and disturbing for an early Christian is that organs were originally installed in stadiums in Roman times to announce gladiators. So if a first century Christian came into our sanctuary, they would believe that they were about to be fed to the lions, for the organ is announcing the way. You're comfortably seated in pews. An early middle-aged Christian worshiper of the 9th century would be aghast. Why are you sitting before the presence of the Lord? For those early churches had no pews. People milled around and stand around while the priest does their things on the altar, speaking in Latin, a language most of the people did not understand at all. They just knew the presence of God. Pews were for comforts, for listening to the Reformation, the Word, the Protestant faith that said Word is more important than ritual. That the spoken Word and needing to be seated was more important, to sit and learn together. Oh, the Pew Bibles. Just a mere 500 years ago, you would have been imprisoned for possessing one, because it was illegal for people to have a translation of the Bible. Only the priests and the authorities could have it. And generation upon generation, each worshiping in the way and manners to which they are accustomed to, that one day the way we worship will be looked at also as artifacts of a different era, like pews of the 14th century or organs of the 12th century. The symbols in our windows, the banners, these coming from Crestview Christian Church, each celebrating the Lord's presence in their own way. And each feeling, whether it's Gregorian chant or Michael W. Smith songs, each somehow connecting to that living presence of God in our midst. But sometimes our protective structures actually restrict God's living presence into us. The flame of God's presence is far away, and we keep staying in the same place, the same dry rituals. There are rituals or traditions that not only keep us safe, but also, in a sense, can find ourselves kept away from God's presence, because we don't want God to upset us too much. Often we find ourselves rendering God's voice silent with the demands and claims of what we like in our worship. We need to live a little closer to that living flame. We need to move wherever it is going, but we also need to gather what we can use in it to draw our story along the journey with God that God has already experienced. For the heart of authentic worship is about encountering a living God rather than summoning a nostalgic. We read Leviticus and we read the sacrifice system and we go, wow, does God really need animals? And the prescribed wheat and grain offerings, or the particular hymns, or the scriptural interpretations, or the specific responses to social and ethical challenges drawn only from an ancient past? How authentic is obedience to the rules of slavery in Exodus. Because a community of faith is one that gathers together the connections of the past. We are in a 1952 building, but we don't gather here to worship 1952, or 1982, or 1992, or 2012. We gather here with the connections with the past in order to discern the directions where the fire may be leading us now, to follow it as it will continue throughout history. Because these connections help us to experience God in our midst, to seek God's direction in our time, and to be encouraged to follow wherever God leads. So the question at the heart of worship is this: does our worship efforts, does our hymns and songs, do our readings and prayers, do our words and actions allow us to experience this living God safely? Or does it allow us merely to reminisce about a God we think is actually dead? For worship shouldn't be just about going through the necessary motions, but it should be about opening our hearts, our minds, our bodies to the necessary moving of the Spirit in our midst. A living God moves, people. A living God acts. A living God responds. And a living God is sending us into this world for this time, for this place. The one who resurrects the dead, the one who rescues the perishing, the one who extends love into the most unloving situations is here. Nadab and Abihu thought God needed a little incense encouragement, shall we say, to come back. The ritual would do the job, so they thought. They were mistaken. God didn't need it. They did. And later on, we read in the Gospels the stories of the Pharisees thinking that Jesus is doing the same things that Nadab and Abihu did. Breaking the traditions of Sabbath, healing on the Sabbath, forgiving sinners, eating with them, healing. God didn't need those rules either. The Pharisees did. So worship isn't a checkoff for God's presence. Worship is a check-in for yours. It isn't about getting comfortable with God. It is about getting called by God. But are we willing to let go of our comforts in order to embrace our calling? Or are we ready to check in with a living God? A living God of flame and spirit, moving, working, present at all times and places. And are you cautious? Prepared to follow this flame wherever direction it intends to go. And Lamont says that ushers shouldn't be nice. Ushers should be distributing life preservers. Women shouldn't be wearing hats in the churches. They should be wearing helmets. For the presence of God is descending and present here, now. Because necessary fire experience will always be required. Amen.